Capitol, in a live hearing watched by 12 million Americans, Kristi Noem pushes a shocking plan. Send undocumented immigrants, including children, to Guantanamo Bay, calling it the only way to protect America. Jasmine Crockett rises from her seat, seemingly outmatched, until she drops evidence so undeniable it turns the entire hearing into a national reckoning. One woman defends power, the other defends humanity. And in a room built to silence dissent, only one voice shatters everything. When the truth finally hits, will America stand up or look away again? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside the marble-clad hearing chamber of the United States Capitol, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the static of tension and televised expectation. Cameras from every major network were positioned at sharp angles, their red lights blinking like bloodshot eyes waiting to catch a fall. The chamber was packed wall to wall, political aides, press corps, restless citizens, and behind the mahogany panel sat the two women who had come to define opposite poles of America's soul. On one side sat Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, known for her ice-cold rhetoric, unyielding border policies, and recent defense of transferring undocumented immigrants to Guantanamo Bay, a plan some legal scholars had already called constitutional treason. Her pearl earrings gleamed under the spotlight as she sat upright, composed, and ready to strike. On the other side stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the unapologetic firebrand from Texas, whose rise had been built not on cautious diplomacy, but on truth told at full volume, and sometimes at personal cost. She adjusted her blazer slowly, not in vanity, but as armor, aware she was walking into a storm that had already been rigged against her. As the gavel dropped, the chair declared the hearing open, and every heartbeat in the room synced to one silent question. When justice speaks against power, will it even be allowed to finish its sentence? And just as the silence turned razor sharp, Kristi Noem adjusted the microphone with the steady hand of someone who had delivered countless political executions without ever raising her voice. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between courtroom composure and battlefield resolve. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't to persuade, it was to dominate. "Let me be absolutely clear," she began, pausing just long enough for the cameras to lock in. "Undocumented immigrants are not victims. They are threats." Her tone didn't tremble. It didn't rise. It simply sliced through the oxygen in the room like a blade. Deliberate, surgical, cruel. "We are not talking about families," she continued, her eyes sweeping the room like floodlights in a prison yard. "We are talking about breaches, in our laws, in our security, in our sovereignty." The weight of her language was designed not just to criminalize, but to dehumanize. And then came the line that turned stomachs and straightened spines. "Guantanamo Bay is not a punishment. It's a necessity. It's the only place left where we can ensure these people are held without risk to the American way of life." Around her, aides nodded like pre-programmed machines. Behind her, a row of Republican lawmakers stiffened into postures of agreement. The word necessity still hung in the air like the aftertaste of metal. She leaned back slightly, satisfied, and delivered her final thrust. "We have coddled illegal entry long enough. This is no longer a border issue. This is a national survival issue, and I, for one, refuse to apologize for defending my country." Her voice never rose, but her message roared through the chamber like a siren. In Kristi Noem's America, mercy was weakness, law was weaponized, and those who didn't belong would be caged, far, far away from the flag they had dared to walk toward. The frost of Kristi Noem's final declaration still clung to the walls when she leaned forward once more, as if what she was about to say had been waiting, sharpened, just beneath her tongue. Her voice dropped half a register, calm, calculated, and lethal in its precision. "For those who insist on portraying these individuals as victims of some broken system," she said, enunciating each word as if reading an indictment, "I'll remind this chamber of the case brought by 10 undocumented immigrants last year." Her eyes swept across the room with icy indifference, not to persuade, but to dominate, her gaze bypassing Jasmine Crockett entirely as if her presence was beneath engagement. They claimed we violated their rights by detaining them without due process. They said being relocated to military custody was unconstitutional. She paused, not for effect, but as if even acknowledging the case required more generosity than she believed they deserved. It went to federal court, she continued, her tone flattening into something even colder. And the case was dismissed, without prejudice, without merit. She sat back slightly, her shoulders squared, lips tight with the grim satisfaction of someone who had just recited a eulogy and didn't plan on mourning. And then, in a voice so stripped of empathy it chilled the room more than if she'd shouted, she uttered the words that would ricochet beyond the chamber walls. They lost. Suck it. The silence that followed was not shock. It was recoil, a kind of spiritual flinch, not just at the obscenity itself, but at the casual violence behind it. It wasn't just a comment, it was a message. To every migrant watching, to every advocate in the room, and to every lawmaker who still believed justice required compassion. Your pain is irrelevant, your voice is noise, and your loss is entertainment. The sting of "suck it" still hung in the chamber, like a venomous fog when Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat. There was no theatrics in her movement, only precision, resolve, and the weight of everything she was about to say. Her fingertips brushed the edge of her notes, but her eyes remained fixed on the dais, steady and unflinching. She wasn't just standing as a congresswoman, she was standing as the daughter of a nurse who'd been denied front-door access to the hospital she served for over 4 decades. She was standing as a lawyer who'd seen too many lives swallowed by a system that called itself lawful but operated on cruelty. And just as she drew breath to speak, to lay down her first line of legal rebuttal, the interruption came like a gunshot across the floor. "Congresswoman Crockett," Kristi Noem barked, her voice louder, sharper, and filled with a kind of venom that didn't need to shout to wound. "If you're more concerned about the lives of criminal trespassers than the security of this nation's children, then maybe you're sitting in the wrong damn room." She didn't just cut Jasmine off. She tried to erase her. The words weren't just a challenge to her argument. They were an attack on her right to exist in that space, to speak with authority, to belong. Gasps fluttered through the gallery like birds startled from a wire, and for one brutal moment, time seemed to bend. Not because of what was said, but because of who it was said to, in the centuries it echoed. Noem didn't look away. She stared straight at Crockett, cold and triumphant, as if daring her to prove she deserved the mic still resting in front of her. And Crockett, still standing, still silent, bore it all. The slight, the venom, the national stage, with a calm that wasn't weakness, but the beginning of a storm. The chamber had already gone quiet in the wake of Noem's cold interruption, but what followed wasn't silence. It was suffocation. Every pair of eyes was locked on Jasmine Crockett, waiting for her to speak, to respond, to assert her place in the room. But before she could even draw her next breath, Kristi Noem leaned into the microphone again, this time slower, closer, with the calm of someone who didn't raise her voice because she knew the system already echoed it for her. Her lips curled into the faintest trace of a smile. Not joy, but certainty. Her tone dropped half an octave, her voice soft enough to seem measured, but soaked in the kind of malice that only those who've never feared exclusion can wield without hesitation. "You know," she said, dragging the words out like a scalpel tracing bone, "if you can't see anything worth defending in this country, maybe it's because you never really belonged to it in the first place." There was no confusion in her delivery, only the cold precision of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She paused, letting the implication rot in the air, then delivered the next blow, not loudly, not angrily, but with a poison more dangerous than either. "Maybe you should go back to Africa." There was no gasp, there was no shout. There was something worse, a stillness so absolute it felt like time had stalled. Aides froze mid-typing. The press gallery fell completely still. The chairperson didn't interrupt. No one did. And in that quiet, the weight of her words crashed down not just on Jasmine Crockett, but on every person in the room who had ever been told they were American in law, but foreign in spirit. Noem didn't stop there. Her eyes scanned the room like a general claiming territory. America, she said, each syllable clipped and cruel, belongs to us, to those who love it, who protect it, not to people who show up to tear it down from within. The words were heavy not because they were original, but because they were ancient. A recycled toxin, dressed in modern language, spoken from behind a government microphone under the seal of the United States. It wasn't a policy dispute. It wasn't even coded language. It was a bare-knuckled declaration of ownership, of the country, of the chamber, of the narrative, and Jasmine Crockett had just been told she didn't fit into any of it. In that moment, Noem wasn't speaking about immigration. She wasn't speaking about Guantanamo. She was speaking about who gets to belong. And by doing so, she wasn't just attempting to erase Jasmine's voice. She was trying to erase her existence from the American story, live, on national television. And the nation was watching. The silence after Kristi Noem's final words was not just quiet, it was surgical. It split the air with the precision of something unspeakable, finally said out loud. Jasmine Crockett remained still, her spine straight, eyes forward, as the echo of "Go Back to Africa" rang without a microphone. She didn't flinch, didn't reach for her notes, didn't cast a glance toward her aides. The room around her felt distant, the whispers of reporters now static, the stiffening of lawmakers like shadows retreating under pressure. She stood in it, in all of it. The insult, the weight, the legacy of being publicly told that her blackness disqualified her Americanness. And then, with a grace that wasn't soft but forged, she stepped forward toward the microphone, her heels striking against the floor like punctuation in a courtroom no one could adjourn. Every eye followed her, some wide in disbelief, others narrowed with anticipation. But Jasmine didn't perform for any of them. She had something to say that didn't need applause. When she reached the mic, her hands remained still at her sides, her shoulders squared. Her voice didn't rise, didn't shake, didn't falter. It dropped, heavy, precise, and deliberate. "I was born in Dallas, Texas," she said, not as a rebuttal, but as a reclaiming. "My mother was a nurse for 43 years. 43. And in all that time, she never once entered the front door of the hospital where she healed people. Not because she wasn't qualified, not because she wasn't needed, but because the color of her skin told them she didn't deserve to be seen." Her eyes locked on Noem like a vice, not with fury, but with a clarity that burned colder than rage. "So let me correct your history," she continued, her tone now sharpened into steel. "I don't need to go anywhere. I didn't come here from somewhere else. I was born in this country. My roots are in this soil. My blood helped build this chamber. And I stand here today not to defend myself, but to defend the idea that this country still belongs to the people who bleed for it, not just the people who hoard it." The silence didn't break. It shattered. Her final sentence hadn't yet cooled in the air when Jasmine Crockett shifted her weight ever so slightly. Not out of hesitation, but to root herself more firmly into the floor beneath her. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. It pressed in from every wall of the chamber, from every camera, every breathless viewer at home, and from the centuries of voices that had been silenced before they ever reached a podium like this. And yet, she didn't flinch. Instead, in one slow, deliberate motion, the kind that reclaims space without asking permission, she lifted her hand and pointed it directly at Kristi Noem. Not with aggression, not with drama, but with the kind of clarity that strips away pretense and reveals exactly where the rod is sitting. The room responded not with gasps, but with stillness. A stunned, reverent stillness, as though everyone present understood, instinctively, that something irreversible had just begun. Jasmine's hand didn't waver. Her finger cut through the charged silence like a scalpel through scar tissue, drawing no blood but exposing everything beneath. It wasn't just a gesture of defiance. It was an indictment. Not shouted, but carved into the record of the room. Her voice, when it came, didn't need to rise. It carried with the force of truth that had waited too long to be spoken aloud. "If you think skin color determines who gets to be called us," she said, her tone icy and exact, "then maybe you are the one who doesn't belong in this room. There was no stutter in her delivery, no pause to savor the moment, because this wasn't a performance. It was a recalibration of authority, of legitimacy, of the invisible lines that had been drawn and redrawn throughout history to exclude people who looked like her. The phrase "doesn't belong" echoed through the chamber like the toll of a slow, heavy bell. And it didn't just refer to Noem's seat at the table. It questioned her moral fitness to occupy any position of power that claimed to represent the people of the United States. The words didn't explode. They sank. They pressed down into the polished wood of the hearing table, into the marble columns, into the bones of the building itself, and into the bones of every person listening who had ever been told they were other in a country they had helped build. It wasn't anger. It was judgment. And that's what made it so devastating. Jasmine hadn't just called Noem out. She had called her in, forced her to stand in the full light of her own rhetoric, stripped of the usual political camouflage. The silence that followed was not the silence of awkwardness. It was the silence of a room recalibrating its gravity. Jasmine's words had shifted the center of power. In one sentence, she had moved the moral authority of the room from the title printed on a nameplate to the truth etched into lived experience. For the first time all morning, Kristi Noem didn't have a response. She didn't reach for her notes. She didn't look to her aides. She didn't even blink. Because something deeper than shame had landed. Something that didn't just bruise but exposed. She sat frozen, her carefully constructed poise now brittle under the weight of what she could not dismiss. Because the moment Jasmine pointed, not just her finger, but the truth, something shifted. The room was no longer operating under Noem's terms. It no longer belonged to the one who had spoken with cruelty and called it patriotism. It now belonged to the woman she had tried to discredit, tried to diminish, tried to exile, and who had just answered with the quiet force of belonging no insult could undo. The silence following Jasmine Crockett's indictment of belonging had not yet lifted when she shifted her weight and reached, with the same steady hand that had moments earlier pointed toward Kristi Noem, for a worn manila folder resting beside her notes. The room was still reeling from the moral shockwave, but now it braced for something different. Evidence. Tangible. Unequivocal. She didn't rush. She opened the folder with the kind of careful finality that made it clear this wasn't a political prop. It was a ledger of truth the nation could no longer afford to ignore. She held up a single page, the official seal of the Department of Defense stamped at the top in embossed black, glinting faintly under the overhead lights like the eye of a witness too long silent. She spoke without haste, but each word landed with the weight of institutional authority. According to this internal Department of Defense security audit, there exists no threat designation, no behavioral risk profile, and no criminal indicator associated with the migrants who were pre-selected for relocation to Guantanamo Bay. A few heads turned sharply, not toward her, but toward each other. She let the statement linger. The silence wasn't for effect. It was for digestion. Then she laid the first page down and drew out another, thicker report. The cover titled plainly, Joint Intelligence Task Force on Migrant Security Risk Assessment, Summary Review, Classified Appendix Excluded. She tapped her finger once on the margin as if to underline the absurdity of what was coming. This is a summary of a full-spectrum cross-agency risk review. It concludes, in language that could not be clearer, that none of the individuals in question presented even a moderate risk classification. Not one had ties to known criminal networks. Not one was flagged by biometric security systems. And not one had a record of violent conduct in any country, let alone on U.S. soil. Her eyes rose from the page and locked with the committee. The expression on her face was not triumphant. It was sober, unforgiving. She wasn't defending a point. She was unveiling a breach. These people were not criminals. They were not insurgents. They were not threats to national security. But they were treated as if they were, labeled without cause, seized without charges, routed into a system that strips away names and replaces them with numbers, as if dignity is a privilege, not a right. She lifted a third document, this one marked with the letterhead of the U.S. State Department's Office of Legal Advisor. It was stamped confidential, but declassified for hearing use. She spoke again, voice low but piercing. And here, from the very office that drafts our foreign policy and ensures our treaty compliance, a legal finding: the extrajudicial detention of civilians, especially those seeking asylum, without formal charges or access to legal counsel, violates multiple provisions of the Geneva Conventions, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Convention Against Torture. She let the gravity settle like a curtain dropping. Her voice did not tremble. It sharpened. We are not protecting our Constitution with these actions. We are violating it. We are not reinforcing our international standing. We are eroding it. What has been proposed, what has been authorized, is not policy. It is a blueprint for state-sponsored erasure. Then, folding the final page with calm deliberation, she looked straight ahead, not at Kristi Noem, but at the eyes of every legislator in the room, every aide taking notes, every camera capturing history in real time. This is not about border control. This is about fear masquerading as authority. This is about cruelty packaged as patriotism. And if we allow the machinery of due process to be bypassed because the bodies caught in it are poor, brown, and displaced, then we are not just failing the Constitution, we are betraying it. There was no applause, no objection, only silence, the kind that doesn't mark the end of a speech, but the beginning of accountability. She stood motionless for a heartbeat longer, the weight of truth pressing into the air like a storm front descending. The final page of the report rested beneath her fingertips, now closed but seething with everything it had exposed. Evidence, not opinion. Legality, not noise. The room was taut, every gaze fixed, every breath halting, as if no one wanted to interrupt the gravity that had settled in the wake of her unflinching clarity. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward slowly, not as a gesture of aggression, but with the deliberate presence of someone who had earned the right to speak with finality. Her voice returned, low and precise, more powerful for its calm. It wasn't angry. It was inevitable. A verdict, not a plea. "Let's be clear," she said, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "There is no one crossing that border with more intent to damage this country than you, Secretary Noem." The silence was immediate, heavy. She let it stretch just long enough to become inescapable. "Those people," she continued, her voice deepening into steel, "they are not storming our gates to destroy. They are crawling to them, with children in their arms, with wounds still bleeding, with hope as their last piece of luggage, because they are running from death." Her tone didn't break, but the room felt it. The tremor not in her voice, but in the uncomfortable stillness that followed. The kind that forces people to listen when they wish they could look away. And you, and with all your power, all your access, all your armored words, you take that desperation and turn it into a weapon. She straightened just slightly, her next sentence spoken with the sharpness of a scalpel tracing the truth. "You are not defending the nation. You are decorating cruelty in the colors of the flag." A pause, one final breath, then the final line. Not shouted, but carved into the floor between them like scripture etched in stone. "You make death legal and call it patriotism." The sentence didn't echo. It landed, heavy, final, unarguable. And when it did, the entire hearing chamber fell under its weight, because what had just been said could not be unsaid. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just challenged Kristi Noem's policy. She had stripped it down to its marrow and forced everyone watching to see what lay beneath the language, the laws, the flags, the applause, sanctioned suffering disguised as safety. And she had done it without raising her voice, because the truth, when delivered with enough precision, is louder than any shout. The heat from Crockett's final statement still lingered in the room like smoke from a controlled detonation, clean, devastating, and impossible to ignore when Kristi Noem's composure finally cracked. Her hands clenched visibly on the tabletop, her shoulders squared not with control, but with rising indignation she could no longer disguise. The performative calm she had mastered through years of press briefings and campaign stops evaporated in a single moment of fury that felt personal, primal. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and rising, slicing through the stillness like shattered glass. If I have to choose, she barked, between some child from Mexico and my child, I will choose my child every single time. Her words didn't just pierce the room. They attempted to divide it. Her tone wasn't defensive, it was defiant. A last-ditch effort to reframe the narrative, not around law or justice, but around tribal survival. Us versus them, mine versus theirs. The tension in the chamber contracted again, not from surprise but from recognition, because everyone knew this argument. It was the oldest one in the book of cruelty. The illusion of moral clarity built on the backs of the powerless. Noem hadn't spoken to defend a policy. She had spoken to justify hierarchy. She invoked motherhood not to protect life, but to diminish it, to suggest that some children mattered more simply because of where they were born, or more precisely where they weren't. And Jasmine Crockett knew it. She didn't blink, didn't turn away. Instead, she leaned in too, not with volume, not with anger, but with a cold precision that cut through Noem's outburst like wire through fog. Her voice dropped half a register, not to soften the blow, but to make sure each syllable landed exactly where it needed to. No one asked you to choose between two children, she said, her words steady, sharpened by restraint. No one forced that question but you. She paused just long enough for the accusation to land, then continued, each sentence more surgical than the last. What you are doing is deciding which child gets to be called a child, and which one gets to be labeled a threat. Her eyes didn't move from Noem's. Her voice didn't rise, and that's what made it devastating. You're not defending your child. You're defending the idea that only children like yours deserve protection, that only children like yours get innocence, that only children like yours are worth saving. The room didn't stir. It couldn't, because Crockett had done something that doesn't happen often in spaces like this. She had stripped away the armor of self-righteous fear and laid bare the moral bankruptcy beneath. Her words weren't a rebuttal. They were a mirror. And for the first time that day, it was Noem who couldn't look directly into it. The moment hung suspended in the air. Crockett's voice still echoing in the moral stillness she had carved into the room. When she turned slightly, never breaking eye contact with the panel, and spoke two words that felt like a final commandment. Roll it. The technician, seated off to the side of the hearing chamber, didn't hesitate. A faint click echoed as the screen behind the witnesses lit up in stark white, then dimmed into color, and then into memory. A memory the nation had tried to scroll past but couldn't. The video began with a wide studio shot, clean lighting, curated backdrop, a host nodding politely across from Kristi Noem, who sat back in her chair like someone used to being told she was right. The segment was clipped at the exact moment that mattered. The host asked about the recent legal challenge brought by undocumented immigrants claiming constitutional violations after being relocated to Guantanamo Bay. Noem shrugged, not apologetically, defiantly. Her voice was almost flippant. They lost, she said, and then, with a smile so slight it chilled the skin more than any smirk, she added, "Suck it." The words echoed out across the chamber again. But this time they didn't feel like a soundbite. They felt like a slap. Replayed not in a studio but in a courtroom. Replayed not on cable news but beneath the dome of the United States Capitol. The silence was immediate and brutal. Noem didn't flinch, but she didn't blink either. Because this time everyone was watching, and there was no laugh track, no commercial break, no Fox News host to pivot the outrage. The screen faded to black for a second, not long enough for anyone to recover, and then lit back up. But the tone was different. The second video was grainier, handheld, intimate. The timestamp in the corner confirmed it had been recorded less than 2 months ago, a refugee camp somewhere in southern Texas. Inside a canvas tent, lit by a single hanging bulb, a woman sat cross-legged on the ground, her clothes damp from the rain that leaked through the seams. In her hands was a photograph, bent, weather-worn, its edges frayed. She didn't look at the camera. She didn't need to. Her voice, when it came, was soft, hollow, translated in subtitles below. "They told me I lost my son." She looked down at the photo. A boy no older than 7, smiling with 2 missing teeth. Her voice cracked. They said he was gone, taken. And then, she swallowed hard. Her lips trembled, but she forced the words out anyway. Not in her native Spanish, but in the English she had learned by necessity, not by choice. They looked at me and said, "Suck it." The screen went black. No music, no narration, no credits. Just silence so heavy it felt like it had mass. And in that silence, the entire hearing room, representatives, aides, staffers, press, sat motionless, trapped in the void between what had just been shown and what could never again be unseen. Noem didn't speak, couldn't, because in that moment, her words had escaped the safety of spin and become what they truly were, a weapon. And Crockett, without raising her voice, had done what no debate ever could. She had shown America exactly where the line had been crossed, and exactly who had stepped over it. The black screen lingered like a wound left open. The image of the mother's trembling voice and hollow eyes burned into the room's collective consciousness. No one spoke. Not a page turned, not a breath dared break the weight in the air. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it. Not triumphant, not vindicated, but resolute, her silence heavier than any closing statement. And then, slowly, she turned. Not to the committee, not to Kristi Noem, not even to the rows of press hunched behind glowing laptops. She turned directly toward the primary broadcast camera, the one streaming into homes, classrooms, living rooms, hospital waiting areas, and bus stations across the country. Her face came into full frame, not with rage, but with a solemnity so grounded it felt like the entire chamber had shifted to make space for what she was about to say. Her gaze didn't waver. Her expression didn't shift. She looked into the lens as if it were a witness under oath. "That," she said, her voice low, steady, and unmistakably final, "is the language that left the mouth of a government official of the United States of America." The room tensed, not because the words were new, but because this time they were irrevocable. No excuses, no spin, no euphemism, just raw, state-issued contempt. Jasmine let the silence stretch, then stepped closer to the microphone, closer to the moment. And that language, those two words, will outlive the press conference. They'll outlive the policy. They'll outlive every talking point meant to soften the blow. She took another step forward, not physically but morally, because while the official who said them will forget, while this chamber will move on to the next bill, the child who heard them through the bars of a detention center will carry them into adulthood. The mother who heard them after losing her son will carry them into grief. And both of them will carry that pain long after the rest of us have stopped watching. Her voice tightened, not with tears, but with clarity. A clarity that burned hot and bright. That was not just a soundbite, that was a sentence, handed down not in a courtroom, but in a hallway of power. And it was delivered with the full force of a government badge behind it. She drew one final breath, controlled, heavy, and gave the room and the country no room to look away. That wasn't policy, it was cruelty, televised and sanctioned. And now it's part of the record, not just of this hearing, but of who we are and who we've let ourselves become. And then she stepped back from the mic, not finished, but done. Because there was nothing left to say. The truth had arrived and it hadn't knocked. It had broken the door down. As Jasmine Crockett stepped back from the microphone, the air in the hearing room didn't return to normal. It thickened, as if the oxygen itself had absorbed too much truth to circulate freely again. The silence that followed wasn't the pause after a powerful speech. It was something colder, something weightier. The kind of silence that settles after a verdict has been rendered, when all the masks have been peeled away and there's nothing left to say that won't sound like retreat. The room did not erupt. It did not respond with outrage or applause. It simply sat, frozen in the wake of a reckoning too precise to escape and too moral to ignore. Across the panel, a few members of Congress lowered their eyes, no longer able to maintain the artificial posture of neutrality. They weren't reacting as politicians now. They were reacting as people, stripped of party lines and talking points. One congressman, rigid all morning with partisanship, slowly folded his hands in front of his mouth and stared at the desk, as if the wood might offer absolution. Another, a woman known for towing the middle line, swallowed hard and looked away, her shoulders sagging under a realization she hadn't expected to confront on live television. It was no longer about left or right. It was about what had just been exposed and whether they had the courage to carry it. To the left side of the public seating area, a woman sat wrapped in a faded woven shawl, her dark braid tucked behind one ear, her eyes rimmed with quiet fire. She was Lakota, a legal advocate from Pine Ridge, invited as an observer to testify later that afternoon on native border displacement. But that moment would never come. She wouldn't need to speak today. Everything that needed to be said had already been delivered with such clarity, such moral force, that her testimony now felt like footnotes to a story already carved in stone. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched Crockett. Not with awe, but with shared grief. A silent understanding passed through her, the way only those who've survived systemic erasure can understand each other without words. A tear broke loose, then another, and she wiped them away not with embarrassment, but with quiet dignity. For once, someone had said the thing, not hinted, not softened, said it fully, and now the whole room had to live with it. Kristi Noem didn't move at first. She sat perfectly still, her face pale, drained of the righteous flush she had carried so confidently when the hearing began. Her hands, once perched in performative stillness atop her prepared remarks, had curled into anxious fists in her lap. She stared forward, unmoving, but not out of defiance. Something in her expression had changed. Not contrition, not recognition. Something else. A crack, a flicker of dread that she might no longer be in control of what came next. Her lips parted slightly as if to speak, perhaps to defend, to redirect, to reclaim the floor. But nothing came. There was no comeback for what had just been said. No memo, no slogan. No speechwriter could spin what millions had just witnessed. For a moment longer, she remained frozen. Then slowly, stiffly, she pushed back her chair. The sound, legs dragging across marble, broke the stillness like a blade through silk. Heads turned, eyes tracked her, but she didn't look at anyone. Not at the panel, not at Crockett, not at the press. She didn't say a word. No apology, no rebuttal, no goodbye. She simply stood, collected her papers without purpose, and walked out of the chamber. Her heels echoed with each step, not like victory, not like authority, but like a retreat cloaked in pride. The doors, once flung open with fanfare upon her arrival, now closed behind her with a heavy finality. She did not glance back. For a long moment, no one moved. It was as if the room itself needed time to process what had occurred. The witness table stood empty. The chair she had once occupied remained slightly off-center, facing no one now. On the screen above, frozen in a digital still, was the image of a Honduran mother holding the photograph of her vanished child. Eyes fixed outward, unspeaking, but louder than any headline. Jasmine Crockett remained where she stood, not basking in triumph, but holding the weight of everything that had just transpired with the steadiness of someone who knew that speaking truth in rooms like this often comes at a cost. Her silence now wasn't hesitation. It was reverence. Reverence for the woman on the screen, for the mothers who never made it past the fences, for the children still waiting in cages, for the democracy still deciding whether it had a conscience. And outside in the cold breath of Washington, D.C., where cameras flashed and commentators waited for spin, the reckoning had already begun. Not in the headlines, but in the eyes of those who had watched the hearing and could no longer pretend they hadn't seen. By the time the heavy doors of the hearing room closed behind Kristi Noem, the tremors of what had unfolded inside were already rumbling through the country, not just across social media, but deep into the veins of power, journalism, and law. That evening, before the sun had fully set over Washington, front pages across the nation began to rewrite the political landscape in real time. The New York Times, usually restrained in tone, went blunt. Brought to her knees by one question, the Washington Post followed with, "Truth unedited, the moment that shook Capitol Hill." On cable news, anchors who had never once mentioned Jasmine Crockett by name now led with her face, her words, her stance. clips of the moment. If you think skin color determines who gets to be called us, aired back to back with the footage of Kristi Noem leaving the chamber in silence. It wasn't just a story, it was a collapse, a rupture, a breaking of the myth that cruelty, if spoken calmly enough, could be mistaken for leadership. Inside the Department of Homeland Security, aides scrambled to prepare a statement that could recast Noem's walkout as a strategic, but nothing landed. No phrasing could erase the sound of "suck it," echoed against the image of a mother mourning a child she'd never see again. Leaked emails from mid-level staffers surfaced the next morning, describing the atmosphere as untenable, morally radioactive, and off the rails. One particularly damning message read simply, "We told her not to go there. She went anyway. She burned it all down." And burn it she had, not in fire, but in light. The kind of light that exposes rather than destroys, the kind that no amount of spin can escape. Meanwhile, at the Capitol, the reverberations hit policy. By noon the next day, the proposed legislative framework that would have codified Guantanamo Bay as a migrant detention zone was formally pulled from the House agenda. No vote, no debate, not even a statement of postponement. It was scrubbed, quietly, hastily, as if it had never been there. The move was confirmed in a one-line press release issued by the Speaker's office. The committee has opted to explore alternative approaches to immigration enforcement. It was bureaucracy's way of folding without admitting defeat. But everyone knew the truth. The bill wasn't withdrawn because of political negotiation. It was withdrawn because it had become political poison. Inside Senate offices, staffers whispered what no one yet dared say into a microphone. Crockett had killed the bill with a sentence. Not a filibuster, not a procedural trick. A single line spoken without shouting, pointed without embellishment. And it had been enough to expose the rotted core of a policy dressed in patriotism. Behind closed doors, one lawmaker, previously a quiet supporter of the bill, was overheard saying, "You can't put that clip next to your name and survive the next election." And in an election year, survival was the only currency that mattered. Meanwhile, Crockett herself avoided the press in the hours following the hearing. She didn't hold a victory speech. She didn't tour cable studios. When asked by reporters for a comment on Noem's walkout or the bill's demise, she responded with just 3 words, "Let the record speak." And it did. The record spoke louder than any press secretary, any pundit, any party whip. It spoke through the still frame of her pointing finger, through the tear-streaked face of the Honduran mother, through the silence of a room full of lawmakers who had run out of excuses, through the footsteps of a secretary who walked into the chamber wielding authority and left it unable to speak. Across campuses and community centers, the hearing became mandatory viewing. Law students replayed it in constitutional ethics lectures. Human rights clinics dissected it like a case study. It was no longer just about immigration. It was about what America had allowed itself to become when no one was watching, and what it still might become when someone finally refused to look away. Commentary pieces from both the left and right acknowledged the same thing. The moment had punctured something deeper than policy. It had called into question the conscience of a country built on the promise of equality, yet so often willing to trade justice for fear. And in that moment, with one sentence, one clip, one name rising out of the smoke, the law had not changed, but the ground beneath it had. Because now every attempt to revive that bill would carry a ghost. Not the ghost of an idea, but of a moment, when someone finally stood up, pointed through the noise, and called cruelty by its true name. And that moment, once televised, could never be undone. As the legislation vanished from the House floor and the headlines solidified her moral victory, the nation turned to its screens and found a new symbol staring back. She didn't walk into the studio like a politician. She walked in like someone who had nothing to sell, nothing to perform, and nothing left to prove. The lights were hot, the set sterile, but Jasmine Crockett sat beneath them as if they didn't exist. No stylists, no rehearsed pre-interview lines, no nervous laughter to pad the silence. She wore a simple black blazer, no pin, no slogan, no flag, just the clarity of someone who had already said everything that mattered when it mattered most. The anchor, a veteran of decades in primetime news, began not with a question, but with a quote that had already gone viral. If skin color determines who gets to be called us, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong in this room. The words hung in the air like prophecy, not memory. Then the camera cut to Crockett. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She simply nodded once and said, "Yes, I meant every word." From that moment, she stopped being Representative Jasmine Crockett and became something else entirely. Across screens and social media, her face, poised, unflinching, was given a name she hadn't asked for, but couldn't shake: the thunder in a season of lies. The phrase originated from an op-ed in The Atlantic, written by a professor of political rhetoric, who described her as the voice that didn't rise, but struck. The metaphor took hold like lightning to dry grass. Cable panels echoed it. Editorials adopted it. Protest signs began carrying it, handwritten in ink. "Thunder doesn't ask for permission," one placard read. "It just arrives." And Crockett had arrived, not with anger, but with authority no title could give, and no insult could take away. What gripped the nation wasn't just what she said, it was how she stood there, unmoved, as the full weight of a government figure's racial attack tried to unmake her in real time, and failed. It was her refusal to match vitriol with volume, her insistence on wielding silence like a blade, facts like fire. She didn't shout, she didn't flinch, she held. And in holding, she exposed something far more terrifying to the machinery of power than outrage. She exposed control. The kind of control that says, "You will not rewrite this moment. I won't let you." The networks leaned in, but none could frame her the way they usually frame politicians. She didn't fit the mold. She didn't ask for redemption. She wasn't apologizing, clarifying, or recalibrating. She was, as one host put it with barely concealed awe, a stillness that shattered everything. And that made her dangerous. Not to the public, not to the people watching, but to the people who had counted on business as usual, counted on cruelty to remain background noise, on conscience to stay off camera. They hadn't expected someone to stop the machine mid-sentence and hold a mirror up to its face. In interviews, Crockett was exact, not evasive. When asked if she believed Kristi Noem should resign, she didn't pivot. "I believe the country saw who she is," she said, "and I believe now the question isn't what she does next. It's what we do next." Every answer was like that, not for headlines, but for history. No spin, no choreography, just a kind of relentless moral clarity that reminded viewers what politics was supposed to sound like before it became theater. Outside the studio, something else was shifting. Voter registration spiked in communities where turnout had historically been low. Civic organizations began circulating her speech in classrooms. Podcasts replayed the clip as gospel. And through it all, Crockett never claimed the crown being handed to her. She didn't declare herself a hero. She didn't cash in. She simply kept showing up. Not louder, but deeper. Each appearance wasn't a tour. It was a continuation of the sentence she had started in that hearing room, when she had drawn a line around cruelty and dared the country to call it what it was. And so the name stuck. The thunder in a season of lies. Not because she was loud, but because she was inevitable. Because she didn't arrive with flash. She arrived with force. Because when the air was thick with denial, her words were the pressure change that couldn't be ignored. And in a nation addicted to noise, it was her silence. Deliberate, commanding, unshakable, that reminded everyone what truth actually sounds like. After the interviews faded, after the headlines cooled and Congress moved on to safer topics, what remained wasn't a debate, it was a wound. And into that wound, a voice returned. Not to reopen it, but to make sure the scar meant something. The screen begins in absolute black. No title card, no network watermark, no sound. Just the vast, quiet nothingness. The kind that forces you to lean in, to wonder if your screen has frozen, or if something's about to begin that will not let go of you. Then a single sound pierces it. Breath. Human. Steady. Not theatrical. the unmistakable sound of someone preparing to say something that costs something. A moment later, Jasmine Crockett's voice arrives. Not booming, not righteous. Calm, low, like someone speaking to a room of one. There is no music behind her, no flash, no framing. Only this. If a wandering child is called the enemy, her tone draws the sentence out like a thread pulled from cloth. Then who, a pause so sharp it cuts, really threatens the American dream? The silence afterward is deafening, but it's not a void. It's an indictment against everything that has pretended to be patriotism, against every policy that called itself law while dressing up cruelty and bureaucracy, against every official who ever whispered security while meaning exclusion. And then, slowly, deliberately, white words begin to fade onto the center of the screen. The letters don't animate. They appear as if they've always been there, just waiting for the world to catch up. Truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to refuse to be silent. The font is plain, sans serif, no logo, no signature. Because this isn't about a party, or a brand, or even a person. It's about what was left behind after all the shouting stopped, and the silence finally had the courage to speak. The line hangs on the screen like a final breath, held just a second longer than comfort allows. And it stays. Long enough to feel real, long enough to hurt, long enough to make you remember why silence, when chosen by the oppressed, is resilience. But when chosen by the powerful, is complicity. There is no music, no montage, no credits, only black, only stillness. And then, the screen fades not to white, but to darkness again. Not to erase, but to remind. Because sometimes the loudest thing in a broken country isn't a chant or a headline. It's a whisper that refused to die, a sentence that didn't blink, a voice that didn't climb, but cut, and a truth that didn't ask to be heard, only refused to go unspoken. And for millions who watch that screen alone, in kitchens and buses, in waiting rooms, in silence, that truth did not just land. It stayed. The screen may have gone dark, but something brighter remained. Not in policy, not in applause, but in the quiet knowledge that something sacred had been reclaimed. The real lesson wasn't written in the congressional record. It wasn't captured in a headline or reduced to a viral clip. It was written in the stillness that came afterward. The breathless space where the nation, for one rare second, remembered what compassion sounds like when it finally refuses to whisper. Jasmine Crockett didn't win because she yelled louder. She didn't triumph because she had more power. She turned the tide because she chose principle over popularity and clarity over comfort. In a room engineered for political theater, she delivered something more dangerous. A mirror, one that forced the country to see the difference between defending a border and destroying a soul. That was the lesson, that dignity is not a line item, that justice doesn't wear a uniform, that a child in a cage doesn't need credentials to be called human, and that silence, the most common currency of complicity, is always louder in the aftermath of cruelty. But it was also a lesson about something deeper, about the cost of empathy in a system designed to punish it, about what it takes to remain human while surrounded by power that has forgotten how. Jasmine Crockett didn't just confront a secretary, she confronted a nation's moral amnesia. She didn't argue for politics. She made a case for memory, for the kind of remembering that hurts, that refuses to flatten pain into policy. She reminded everyone watching that the question isn't whether we have the right to detain children. The question is, who do we become when we do? Her words weren't strategy, they were scars made audible, and in making them audible, she made them undeniable. For millions of viewers who had never been seen by the institutions that claimed to serve them, Crockett's defiance wasn't just inspiring, it was permission. Permission to grieve, to speak, to reclaim the parts of themselves that had been disfigured by systems that called cruelty procedure. The woman from Honduras whose words shook a nation, she wasn't an exception. She was a reminder that behind every file labeled detained minor, there is a bedtime story left unfinished, a birthday missed, a scream buried beneath legal terms. And Jasmine didn't just speak for them. She forced the system to listen, to witness, to remember, even if only for a moment. The human lesson didn't end when the bill was pulled. It didn't end when Kristi Noem walked out. It began when people who had grown numb began to feel again, when indifference, once a shield, became a shame, and when silence, which had once protected the powerful, turned against them. Jasmine Crockett showed the country that resistance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a voice that doesn't flinch. Sometimes it's truth delivered without decoration. Sometimes it's a woman standing still while the machinery of a nation tries to erase her and fails. And most haunting of all, most unforgettable, is what she left us with. The reminder that justice will never shout over injustice. It will simply outlast it. Because the truest revolution doesn't always come in thunder. Sometimes it comes in someone saying, "No, not this time, not in my name," and meaning every word. But reflection alone has never been enough. And Jasmine Crockett did not fight to make us feel. She fought to make us move. The final image may have faded. The broadcast may have ended. But the truth she unleashed doesn't live in headlines or hearings. It lives in what we do next. Because what was exposed inside the chamber wasn't just one woman's prejudice or one law's cruelty. It was a blueprint for how injustice hides behind flags, podiums, and polished rhetoric. Now it's your turn. Your turn to decide whether that story ends with applause or action. Not everyone can speak into a congressional mic, but everyone can raise their voice where silence once reigned. Start with your vote. Start with your voice. Start with your refusal to accept a system that treats children as threats and dignity as a luxury. Because if injustice learned to dress itself in law, then justice must become our daily resistance. Do not wait for permission to care. Do not wait for the next scandal to be outraged. The fight Jasmine waged in that room was never meant to stay there. It was meant to follow you home, to your city hall, to your school board, to your dinner table. Because injustice thrives in abstraction, but it dies when people get specific. Find the name of the bill, the district of the lawmaker, the next vote on the calendar. Don't repost, don't just react. Organize, register, volunteer, donate, show up, not once, not for the optics, but again and again, until what happened to that mother from Honduras is unthinkable, not inevitable. Until the phrase Guantanamo for migrants becomes a shameful memory, not a legislative possibility. Let this moment be more than a memory. Let it be a fault line, the kind that shakes loose apathy and forces the foundation to crack. You don't need to be famous to make noise. You don't need a platform to protect someone. You just need to act like the truth matters more than your comfort. Ask your representatives what they're doing. Ask your school what it teaches. Ask your police what they've learned. Because every time we choose not to ask, we tell injustice it can stay. But here is what history teaches us. If we dare to listen, no system dismantles itself. No policy softens without pressure, and no country heals without accountability. Jasmine Crockett didn't stand up to be remembered. She stood up so no one would forget who paid the price when we stayed quiet. She didn't win with volume or vengeance. She won with vision. A vision that requires all of us to carry it forward, not for applause, not for attention, but for survival, for those still caged, for those still voiceless, for those whose names will never make the news. This is the part where we stop watching and start doing. This is the moment where we decide whether we will be the ones history will thank or the ones it will indict, because every generation gets one defining test of conscience, and this is ours. It doesn't come with banners or anthems. It comes in the quiet decision to act when it would be easier not to. It comes when we stand up for people we will never meet, because no child should have to prove they are human to be treated like one. It comes when we realize that democracy is not a gift we inherit, but a responsibility we choose, again and again, in the face of fear. So take the rage you felt watching that hearing and do something with it. Take the disbelief and the heartbreak and the fire that lit inside you, and move. Don't wait for someone else. Be the someone else. Be the one who writes to Congress. Be the one who calls out the lie. Be the one who tells the truth even when it costs you. Be the thunder in your own community, the force that breaks silence, the voice that doesn't tremble. They will tell you it doesn't matter, that you're too small, that you're too late. Don't believe them. Jasmine Crockett was one woman in one room against a machine built to ignore her, and she still broke through. So can you. They will tell you to calm down, to wait your turn, to let the system fix itself. But if the system could fix itself, we wouldn't have children behind razor wire and mothers dying with their stories untold. This is not about charity, it's about solidarity. It's about building something no tear gas, no talking point, and no border wall can erase. A country that finally recognizes the humanity it tried so hard to forget. So register, vote, march, speak, protect, uplift, defend. Not in theory, but in action. Not in temporary outrage, but in permanent resolve. Because the real revolution doesn't start when the cameras roll. It starts when you decide the story will not end with someone else's silence. It starts now, and it starts with you. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.